President Zelensky, I think, has been very sharp in aligning himself with what Trump is saying. And what Zelensky said, you may remember an interview in Sky News a few weeks ago, is that they can imagine a situation where there's a ceasefire in place. They dispute Russia's occupation of their territory, but they agree not to try to take it back militarily, but by other means. And that can lead to a peace, provided that there are meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine going forward. And I think that is kind of the shape of where this is headed right now. And I think Trump putting the pressure on Putin to stop the war will probably produce some results this year.
Now, back to our main story here in the United States, inauguration day, of course. Donald Trump said he'd broker a peace deal in Ukraine on day one of his second presidency. To nobody's surprise, his advisors are now saying it will take them 100 days. But the new president is still very much inclined to force Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. So what does he have in mind? Kurt Volker is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. He was U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019. He joins me now. Kurt Volker, thank you for joining me on Times Radio. Can I start with this general point? Is it fair to say that since victory now looks very far away for either side in this conflict, that negotiations are now inevitable?
Yeah, I think there'll be some kind of stabilization of the conflict this year. Putin needs that. His economy is in terrible shape. They have very high inflation. They're printing rubles to cover a big budget deficit. They're spending 40% of their state budget on this ridiculous military effort right now. They don't have enough soldiers. They don't have enough equipment. And they're not making much ground, even though they're suffering terrible casualties. But they're not gaining a lot of ground. So,
and I see they're eating into their sovereign wealth fund. They're running out of liquid assets in that as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the Ukrainians also need a break. They are having trouble with recruitment, and they, of course, depend on the West for supplies of arms. But in some ways, they are more resilient, and of course, they're defending their own homes. So they don't have the option but to keep defending themselves. President Zelensky, I think, has been very sharp in aligning himself with what Trump is saying. And what Zelensky said, you may remember an interview in Sky News a few weeks ago, is that they can imagine a situation where there's a ceasefire in place. They dispute Russia's occupation of their territory, but they agree not to try to take it back militarily, but by other means. And that can lead to a peace, provided that there are meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine going forward. And I think that is kind of the shape of where this is headed right now. And I think Trump putting the pressure on Putin to stop the war will probably produce some results this year.
It's always hard with Donald Trump to kind of get a handle on the shape of things to come when he's involved. But am I right in thinking that what it looks like is that he wants a ceasefire that would freeze the existing battle lines? That would then, he hopes, lead to to talks, which in return would lead to a negotiated settlement. And inevitably, in that, clearly Mr. Putin wouldn't get all that he originally set out to get, but it would involve some loss of territory for Ukraine.
Well, I don't quite see it that way, because Putin, in my view, is never going to give up on his maximalist objectives. He wants a compliant Ukraine that is part of a greater Russian empire. He doesn't believe in Ukraine's nationality, its national identity, language. He certainly doesn't want to abide by Zelensky being in power. He wants to control who's in power in Ukraine. I don't think he's going to give up on any of these objectives. So I think the more realistic scenario is that you have a ceasefire and you have something of a deterrent against future attacks by Russia. And maybe there isn't a full comprehensive peace deal.
It's interesting because even if Ukraine was to lose some territory, which would be hard for Ukraine to stomach, it would leave a huge chunk of Ukraine that was still European-looking, had ambitions to join the European Union, although it has to be shelved in the short term, I suspect, but NATO membership, it would still hope one day to go. And that's exactly, even if it's not all of Ukraine, that's exactly the kind of Ukraine Mr. Putin and the Kremlin doesn't want.
Exactly. But they've overplayed their hand. both militarily and economically. They've also strengthened a Ukrainian national identity, character, relationship with the West in ways that weren't
Indeed.
true before this full-scale invasion. And this is, very similar to what happened with Germany after World War II. You had West Germany that was brought into NATO, central to the creation of the European Union. It was in their constitution that they were going to get all of Germany together again, that they would be united. But it didn't happen for 40 years, but then it did. And I think we're going to see a situation where 80% of Ukraine is in the EU, and as you say, eventually joining NATO, although the timing is not clear. And we'll be playing for time until all of Ukraine is united again.
And West Germany prospered and East Germany didn't. It's very interesting, Kurt Volker, what you say. We'll need to leave it there for now, but you've given us a lot to think about and put some shape on the way things could go, and I'm grateful for that here on Times Radio. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Now, coming up, is it all over for diversity, equity, inclusion? I'll ask one of America's most seminal thinkers, Noah Roman, on Trump America's war on woke. This is Andrew Neil. You're listening to Times Radio.
Embarrassment to the history of this country, and I say Putin would not have gone into Ukraine if that didn't happen. When he saw the incompetence of Milley and all these guys that are incompetent, when he saw that happen, when they took out the soldiers first, they took out the soldiers first. If you go back and check your records, for 18 months I had a talk with Abdul. Abdul was the leader of the Taliban, still is. But I had a strong talk with him. For 18 months, not one American soldier was shot at